Welcome to the second video lecture in the course Introduction to Poetry. Introduction to Poetry, the course has been designed to educate about all forms of literature and to give an introduction about them. So, in the second lecture, I start with the topics in the first unit, which is the unit on poetry. The first unit introduces poetry and aims to give an explanation about forms of poetry. So, I begin with some oft-quoted phrases, some famous quotations about poetry. So, the most famous quotation on poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, as defined by William Wordsworth. And to work upon Matthew Arnold's definition of poetry, poetry is the best expression of that which always have been thought. Then, according to Dr. Johnson, poetry is a metrical composition. To understand what poetry is for a beginner of, for a beginning student, a student who begins to learn literature, Wordsworth's quotation and Matthew Arnold's quotation may come in handy. Thomas Carlyle defines poetry as a musical thought, arrangement of words according to the musical order. And John Ruskin defines poetry as follows: suggestion by the imagination of noble grounds and for noble purpose. So, Carlyle and Ruskin, they have defined poetry according to the 19th century understanding of literature. Now, moving on to a romanticized understanding of poetry according to the words of Coleridge. Coleridge defined poetry as the rationale for existence of poetry as poetry of the highest kind may exist without any meter. So, thereby he says that musical arrangement of words may not always be necessary for writing and reading a poem. Aurora Leigh, the Victorian poet, defines poetry as a kaleidoscopic presentment of modern life. In that way, she wants to highlight, or she wants to say that poetry is an expression of the five senses through words in writing. Now, poetry, the written form of poetry, can be broadly divided into subjective and objective poetry. Subjective poetry is a poem which is written from the point of view of a poet or a narrator. It is mostly written in first person narrative. Most often, the first person pronoun I and we are used in the subjective poetry. The poet tells his or her own experience, her own understanding, her own vision of the part of life which she wants to versify. An example of subjective poetry is Ode on the Intimations of Immortality by William Wordsworth, where the poet versifies his personal experience with nature and the the inspiration that he derives from nature. So that is the type subjective poetry. The next broad type of poetry is objective poetry. In an objective poem, the poet talks about something which is external, something which is third to him, something which is not part of him. For example, he may talk about or he may versify about an object, about a thought, about a place, about an action, and so on. An example for objective poetry is a valediction forbidding mourning by the metaphysical poet John Donne. Another way of classifying poetry is meditative and philosophic. To elaborate, a meditative poem is a poem in which the poet takes upon a topic and thinks about it in a subjective manner and writes about or versifies his or her own understanding about it. The topic or the idea developed by the poet comes out of her own imagination, comes out of her own meditation, where it requires deep thought on the part of the reader. The poet invites the reader to meditate on a thought, to think deeply about a thought along with her through the poem. Another variety, another type of poetry in the second classification is philosophic. A philosophic poem is a poem in which the poet takes upon an idea and philosophizes, give a world view. The poet discusses both sides of a particular idea and moves on from the specific to the general or from the general to the specific of a broad-based idea. For example, the poem Empedocles on Etna, in which Matthew Arnold takes his idea from the mythological figure of Empedocles, but he makes use of the idea to philosophize or to give an understanding, to give a political background, understanding of the Victorian politics. So these are the broad divisions of poetry. Thank you.